But a lot of what I'm going to talk about is summarising all the brilliant stuff that you've heard from almost everybody else sort of so far. Just reminding you why all this is important, that in the pre-antibiotic era, we saw 4 times as much mortality. And antibiotics really allowed us to start doing complicated surgeries, keeping premature babies alive, allowed us to organ transplantation and give chemotherapy. So just remember that when I talk to you some of the bits in case they disappear. AMR is not going away. That's why I'm quite happy staying in this particular sort of role. We've got massive numbers of countries who've got lots of resistant TB across the world. Almost 750,000 people die from drug-resistant infections each year. Antibiotic consumption, which drives resistance, is going up and up and up, especially in humans and lower middle income countries and also within the animal sector, and I'll talk about that in a wee while. In the developed and the rich world, it's about excess antibiotics. In the poorer countries, it's a lack of access to antibiotics. So we're still seeing lots of people die purely because they can't get access to antibiotics. And we've heard the story again and again. No new antibiotics since the 1980s. And the pipeline for the antibiotics against the bugs that we really need, there's hardly any bits sort of coming through. And I'll talk to you about some of the bits which are coming through as well. I'm going to skip over that one because I'll show you on in 2 slides time what we've achieved. We're being filmed, so I'll choose my words carefully. I'm not allowed to mention a previous Prime Minister. The last thing that he did really well was appoint Jim O'Neill to lead on the AMR approach, and they actually reported only a few weeks ago. And it was more a case of countries in the world who've not started doing anything about it, get your finger out and start, and we need much more investment to try and drive new antibiotics, diagnostics and other therapies going through. And there's a big discussion at the moment saying, do we need some sort of huge global sort of bank for the whole AMR agenda? And that's the big debate that's sort of going on at the moment. And it's all about countries having a national action plan and then optimising predominantly the use of antimicrobial medicines in animal and human sort of health. And there are the 10 areas to focus on. So partway through the previous National Action Plan, the government did respond to Jim O'Neill's report and actually came up with a few sort of smart objectives and put real numbers sort of in there. And it was about trying to reduce inappropriate antibiotics, reduce gram-negative bloodstream infections, which I'll show you again in a while, that we're not a hope in hell and chance of achieving. But the animal side have done really well, and I'll show you some slides in a moment. They've done really well off their own back. No incentive schemes or anything else. They've been really good. The antibiotic pipeline and being reinvigorated is so important, I put it on twice for those with good eyesight. And there is figures being bandied around in the regions of £20 million to actually have new antibiotics to be made available. There will be a pilot project which some work will start in July, looking probably at one existing antibiotic and one potential pipeline, almost a bit like the fire service. So the fire service is something you never ever want to use, but we pay for it in our taxes and we never think anything about it. And that's one of the models that's been proposed for new antibiotics, is we will just pass a lump of money over to the pharma industry and we can use the antibiotics if we need to. A bit more complicated, and that will be coming soon. A bit about public awareness campaigns and then continuing the work sort of internationally, and I'll show you some graphs in a while. So what have we achieved? So this is on a graph. So one, we probably have the most comprehensive surveillance systems that exist probably in the world now, and that's for antimicrobial resistance surveillance and also for consumption surveillance, and it's been made open access. The PHE AMR Fingertips portal really is, and whilst we had the lies about it before, and it's open to how you interpret it, it's openly available and you can look at almost anything that we collect data in the whole AMR field. There's been over a third of $1 billion spent invested in research. The Fleming Fund, which is doing a lot of work in the overseas, has put 265 million in, and they've partly just launched, I don't know if any of you are involved, working with 4 African countries at the moment with hospital antimicrobial stewardship. We've got some antimicrobial prescribed measures I'll talk about in a moment, and there's been various incentive schemes. And then they've strengthened the whole legal framework around infection prevention control and stewardship. And then there's been a whole load of awareness raising, and I'll share a couple of slides in a while about that. So you've seen Fingertips already. If you've not ever visited it, go and have a look at it. It's a wealth of data out there. Neil said, big me up. So this is my, big the hospital up. So this is RCH data plotted of your last 12 months of total antibiotics on the horizontal per 1,000 admissions and carbapenems on the vertical. And the little black diamond is RCH, which is pretty impressive. So if anything else, you can have a second piece of cake and pat yourselves on the back when you leave. So well done you. And you can see you're well beneath the English mean. So you're doing some pretty good stuff down here. I'll skip over that, just say that we're monitoring drug-bud combinations. So this is quite important. So this is what's happening to resistance over the the last 4 years. Basically, it's near enough stable, apart from one drug. The one we give to 22% of our total usage of IVs, coamoxiclav. And you can see in E. coli, which is the tall blue one, resistance is growing, and you can see it's getting up towards 50%. You wonder why we still bother using it. And then even in Klebsiellas. But everything else generally across the board is staying pretty stable. And that's a pretty good message, I think. And there's a few problems with gonorrhea. But, and this is the big but, we're seeing, because of the aging population, the number of antibiotic-resistant bloodstream infections has increased by 35%, and this is a real challenge. And it's mainly, I don't know if you can see on the colours, it's mainly on the gram-negative, so E. coli, and this is why there's a focus on it at the moment. And on the right-hand side is just to show you roughly some of the numbers and the mortality that we're seeing at 30 days. So it's killing a lot of our patients, and that's why there's a focus on it. We're also worried about carbapenem resistance on here, and it's slowly increasing only because we're looking for it a bit harder. But the number of actually bloodstream infections is just slowly creeping up, except if you're in certain parts of London and the northwest, which is slightly higher. And this is why we work with some of the overseas countries. So the top two, left-hand side is multi-drug resistant E. coli. The top right is the same for Klebsiella pneumoniae. And these are resistant to third-generation cephalosporins, ceftazidime, to the non-micro here, fluoroquinolone, so ciprofloxacin, aminoglycosides on there. And you can see from the south and the east of Europe, the darker colours for the levels of resistance, which is up there. And then the bottom left is carbapenem resistance. And you can see there's a problem in Italy, there's problems in Greece on there, and then I can never remember if it's Romania and Bulgaria, but they've got high levels of resistance, very similar to some of the London hospitals that we heard about earlier. And then on the bottom right, we've got resistance to penicillin, strep pneumo, which is a worry as this coming up. So even though we don't see much resistance in this country on a day-to-day basis, it's really nudging at the door. And this is some really useful data that came out last year. And if you just look at the left-hand side of the number of deaths that are happening per year, and it's got to a level where the European Centre for Disease Control have actually warned Italy, Greece and Romania that if resistance continues at the rate it is in these countries, they've reached a time where it's probably not safe to give cancer treatments, do major surgery or ITU admissions. That's because the inevitable infections you'll get by giving any of these things, so the immunosuppression or the chemotherapy, you will get infections and the resistance is so high. and that is in European countries, and I find that quite worrying. So we've defined inappropriate prescribing. So it's prescribing there's no infection, using too broad an antibiotic, or continue it for too long. We've heard some fabulous stuff about this already. And it's estimated that it's about 20% of prescribing is inappropriate, and that's some work from the community and some work at the moment which we publish for excess days in hospital. And I know here at the RCH you actually have continued the audit for excess days. NICE have started to pull together some common infection sort of guidelines, because there hadn't been much out there for sort of hospitals. And the good news is actually it's focusing on when not to give an antibiotic, or where to give a delayed antibiotic, if there's clinical scoring systems to use them, and actually some durations, and it's driving for some of the shorter durations. So how are we doing? Well, the good news is on the left is how we're doing in reductions in humans, 7% reduction, almost all primary care. And on the right-hand side is what's happening in animals, and you can see this huge 40% reduction in animals. And the reason I've put them together is there is this crossover of resistance. If you reduce your consumption in animals, this meta-analysis that was done last year showed that you can actually reduce it in humans by about a quarter in there, but especially those that work with livestock. And certainly in rural area like Cornwall, it's quite a big potential sort of issue on that. And that's why we have to look at things as a whole. So how are we doing? If you actually throw all the antibiotics that we give to animals and to pets and to people together, and then divide it by the population, you come up with this concept called antibiotic footprint, okay? And you can see how the reductions have taken place sort of in all the various bits and pieces. So overall, we've reduced since 2013 by 19%. And just to give you an idea what that means globally, the little bubbles on the right-hand side, you can see the UK down towards the bottom on there, how we compare with other countries. And you can see we've reduced our footprint to about just under 12 grams from 14 grams in a few years. And this is one of the things we really want to get people thinking about, is what you can do to reduce your consumption, not just in the human sector, but in the whole sector through vaccination, better hand hygiene, more sensible choices and things like that. So, bit of bits on what they're doing in the animal world. You can see across the board we've seen big reduction in pigs, big reduction in turkeys, broilers and ducks, which is excellent. And then the critically important antibiotics, which are third and fourth generation cephalosporins, fluoroquinones, and colistin, you'll see huge reductions there, which means they're not using the antibiotics that we want to use in humans and drive resistance, which is great. And in terms of resistance, I've just put E. coli up here, but they've shown some good progress in Salmonella as well. It's all colour coded, so green is 2015, purple 16 and red 17, and you can see how much it's reduced on there. So they're doing really well on the sort of the farmers around here. I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to just point out that whilst we might have done quite well reducing carbapenem consumption by 10%, we've driven up our total antibiotic usage, and part of that's the sepsis agenda. I'll skip that. And whilst and what I'd say is go away and have a look at this, because suspicion of sepsis, whilst we're seeing lots of it, almost 2 million admissions a year, causes 60% of the sort of the deaths, we have seen improvements in screening and time to treatment, but it's driven antibiotic use enormously on there. And you can look at individual data. So this is Cornwall data. So if you look at this website, this is done by Matt Inara Kim, you can see potentially your survival rate. So for Cornwall, if we come in code of a sepsis, 83% survive at 30 days on there. And so you can actually look at your own data. It's a superb source. I'm not going to talk about this, but I'm going to talk about this briefly. We have not hit our reduction in healthcare associated E. coli's. The community onset is the orange one at the top. You can see it's actually higher, and for the last year, and it's green for hospital onset. So we're not doing well. Why we're not doing well? difficult to know. I think people thought it was catheter related. Probably isn't. Most of it's community onset UTI source. We probably give out too much coamoxiclav. There has been some work saying a no antibiotic approach might actually drive E. coli bloodstream infections, but it was before we focused on it. And we do know, this is unpublished work, but up to about a third of patients who get an E. coli bloodstream infection were treated with the same antibiotic before. So that's poor prescribing practice sort of going on. And there's lots of people trying to drive this, getting rid of urine dipsticks and improving hydration. And I think there is a debate about greater diversity. I'm not going to talk about diagnostics because I think we have failed. I think we have done really badly on diagnostics, and that's because we've got poor quality evidence, and therefore when NICE reviewed it, they can't recommend anything. Dentistry has done really well. They've reduced their prescribing by about 50% over the last 4 years. So they're doing really well, and they've got some brilliant campaigns about antibiotics don't cure toothache. We've got lots of education everywhere. I have to plug what BSAC do. They do lots of free courses around the world, free books on everything. And if you're doing the sequins and antifungal stewardship, today we've launched an antifungal stewardship e-learning sort of tool. Let's have a look at that. Keep Antibiotics Working campaign, you probably saw it. It annoyed the pants off you. But the impact was 78% of the public would not ask their GPs for antibiotics. 93% of GPs said it helped them to say no to antibiotic requests. So potentially some good bits. There's some useful leaflets out there, some work that's being submitted for publication. I think you took part in the Southwest, was showing community pharmacists use this, can reduce the number of patients who will go to their GP asking for advice. Lots of things about educating kids, because they will then educate their parents and grow up good habits. I do believe we are going to have our musical, The Mold That Changed the World, which is like the history of resistance. So I think that's coming to Cornwall, and school children do it. So I go and say, have a look at that. You do a brilliant campaign here for One Health in Leeds. We have something called Seriously Resistant. We have buses driving around telling the message of resistance, pledge hedges and things like that. And in a year we got 16,000 pledges, and we have community champions. So the plan is for the next 5 years is about AMR being contained and controlled by 2040 in there. And for me, there's something about public health being involved. So how can we have a lower burden infection? How can we change lifestyle to stop diabetes and things like that, which will take up more antibiotics? And I'll skip that one. This is the last slide. So this is the summary of the entire day that you've been sort of doing already. These are the targets on the left-hand side. We're yet to decide, but there's going to be some targets for reducing drug-resistant infections. Carbapenem-resistant gram-negative infections will become notifiable. There is a unachievable target to reduce healthcare-associated gram-negative bloodstream infections. There's going to be stronger board-level leadership for both infection prevention control and stewardship. We're going to reduce antibiotic use by 15% by 2024, gulp, which will be 25% in the community. And we're going to reduce reserve, so that's the reserve antibiotics, and the watch, which are mainly cephalosporins, fluoroquinolones, etc., by 10%. And for the diagnostic people, we are going to be able to quantify the number of prescriptions informed by a diagnostic test or a scoring thing for the first time, which would be good. The animals are going to keep on doing their fab stuff. So that was a whiz through of everything we've done, and so well done, Cornwall. You've done absolutely amazing. And that's it.